On a cold winter day in 2021, the Spokane Police Department made a stunning announcement that sent shockwaves through the entire community and captured national attention. After more than 6 decades of investigation, countless dead ends, and generations of detectives working tirelessly on the case, they had finally identified the person responsible for killing 9-year-old Candy Rogers back in 1959. It was possibly the most well-known cold case not just in the city of Spokane, but in the entire state of Washington. The case had haunted the community for over 60 years, remaining unsolved despite massive search efforts, extensive investigations, and the dedication of numerous law enforcement officers who had worked on it throughout their entire careers. But thanks to modern DNA technology and the determination of investigators who refused to give up, the truth was finally uncovered. So what exactly happened to little Candy Rogers on that fateful day in March 1959? Did she simply get lost in the woods and fall victim to a tragic accident? Or did she suffer a fate far worse than anyone could have imagined? To understand this story, we first need to travel back in time to the 1950s and learn about the city where this tragedy occurred. Spokane is a beautiful city located in the eastern part of Washington state, near the border with Idaho. In the 1950s, Spokane was a thriving, mid-sized American city with a strong sense of community. Neighbors knew each other by name. Children played freely in the streets and neighborhoods, and parents felt comfortable letting their kids walk to school or ride their bikes around town without constant supervision. It was a different time in America, an era when people generally felt safe in their communities and trusted their neighbors. Spokane was known for its rich cultural heritage and natural beauty, making it a popular destination for outdoor enthusiasts who loved hiking, fishing, and exploring the surrounding forests and mountains. The city offered a thriving downtown area, with plenty of shopping, dining, and entertainment options for families. The community took great pride in their city and worked together to make it a wonderful place to raise children. Candace Rogers, who everyone called Candy, was born in 1950 to parents Elaine and Carl Rogers. She was their only child, and from the moment she was born, her parents cherished and adored her completely. As an only child, Candy received all of her parents' love and attention, and they worked hard to provide her with a happy childhood filled with opportunities to learn and grow. Those who knew her in the community described her as a pleasant and friendly child who was always willing to help others. She loved to laugh and play, and she had a natural gift for making friends wherever she went. At some point during Candy's early childhood, her parents' marriage began to fall apart for reasons that were never fully explained to the public. Whatever problems existed between Elaine and Carl eventually became too much for them to overcome, and they made the difficult decision to get divorced and go their separate ways. Divorce was less common in the 1950s than it is today, and it carried more social stigma, but Elaine and Carl knew it was the right choice for their family. After the divorce was finalized, Candy remained in the care of her mother, Elaine, who worked as a school teacher. This was a respectable and stable profession that allowed Elaine to support herself and her daughter, though money was often tight for the single mother. Elaine did her absolute best to provide for Candy and ensure that her daughter never felt like she was missing out on anything because of the divorce. Despite the challenges of being raised by a single mother in the 1950s, Candy was a happy and well-adjusted child who thrived in school and in her community. She was a popular face around the neighborhood, and people of all ages enjoyed seeing her friendly smile and hearing her cheerful greetings as she walked to school or played outside with friends. By 1959, Candy was 9 years old and attending 4th grade at Holmes Elementary School. Her teachers described her as an attentive student who always tried her best and was eager to participate in class discussions and activities. Like many girls her age in the 1950s, Candy joined a youth organization called the Bluebirds. The Bluebirds were the younger members of a larger national organization known as the Campfire Girls of America. This organization was similar to the Girl Scouts and aimed to provide young girls with education, character development, and recreational activities that would help them grow into confident, capable young women. The Campfire Girls organization had a specific mission: to encourage personal growth, self-reliance, service to others, and a deep connection to nature and the outdoors. Candy absolutely loved being a member of the Bluebirds. She got actively involved in all the activities that the group organized, which included camping trips into the beautiful forests surrounding Spokane, community service projects to help people in need, hiking adventures to explore nature, arts and crafts projects, and many other fun and educational activities. She enjoyed every moment she spent with her fellow Bluebirds, and the organization gave her opportunities to develop new skills, challenge herself, and make wonderful memories with friends. Candy was growing into a smart, capable, and happy young girl with a bright future ahead of her. Everyone who knew her, her mother, her teachers, her neighbors, her fellow bluebirds, and her relatives, could see that she had enormous potential and would likely grow up to accomplish great things. However, no one could have predicted or expected that a heartbreaking tragedy would soon take this precious little girl away and shake the entire Spokane community to its very core. On the afternoon of Friday, March 6, 1959, Candy returned home from Holmes Elementary School just like she did every other weekday. She was in good spirits and looking forward to the weekend ahead. It was a Friday, which meant she had 2 full days off from school to relax, play with friends, and enjoy being a kid. However, Candy also had an important task she wanted to complete that afternoon before the weekend really got started. The Bluebirds organization was trying to raise money to fund one of their upcoming activities or camping trips. As part of the fundraising efforts, all the members of the group were given boxes of campfire mints to sell in their neighborhoods. These were delicious mint-flavored candies that were popular in the community, and selling them door to door was a common way for youth organizations to raise funds in the 1950s. Candy had been given 7 boxes of campfire mints that she planned to sell that day. She was excited about the opportunity to help her Bluebirds group raise money, and she was confident that her friendly personality and polite manner would help her sell all 7 boxes quickly. The mints cost just a small amount of money, and most people were happy to support the local youth organization by buying a box or 2. Candy approached her mother, Elaine, and asked if she could leave the house to sell the mints in their neighborhood. Elaine thought about the request for a moment and then gave her approval. She trusted her daughter and knew that Candy was responsible and mature for her age. However, Elaine reminded Candy of an important family rule that she'd established. Candy must not spend too much time outdoors, and she absolutely had to return home before dark. This was a rule that Candy had always followed faithfully in the past. Elaine made sure to remind her daughter of this rule every single time Candy left the house to play with friends or run errands in the neighborhood. It was important to Elaine that Candy understood the importance of being home before darkness fell. In the 1950s, most parents had similar rules for their children, as being out after dark was considered less safe. If Elaine had known that this particular day would be different, that something terrible was about to happen, she would have never let her daughter walk out that door. She would have held Candy close and kept her safe at home, but Elaine had no reason to suspect that anything bad would happen. Their neighborhood was safe and familiar, and Candy had sold mints and gone door to door many times before without any problems. Before leaving the house, Candy ate a quick snack consisting of an oatmeal cookie to give her some energy for her afternoon of selling mints. She also took a few moments to play with their family dog, a beloved pet that Candy loved dearly. After saying goodbye to her mother and giving the dog one last pat on the head, Candy grabbed the 7 boxes of campfire mints and made her way out the front door and into the neighborhood. The time was approximately 4 p.m. in the afternoon. The sun was still shining brightly in the sky, and there were several hours of daylight remaining before darkness would fall. It was a typical early March day in Spokane, still quite cold, but with the first hints of spring beginning to appear. That afternoon, there were several other girls around Candy's age who were also selling campfire mints and other types of chocolates and candies door to door throughout the neighborhood as part of various fundraising efforts. Candy joined some of these other girls, and they walked together through the neighborhood, knocking on doors and politely asking if people would like to purchase their products. The girls chatted and laughed together as they made their sales, enjoying the beautiful afternoon and the opportunity to earn money for their organizations. Nobody knows exactly what happened next, or at what point Candy became separated from the other girls. Nobody saw anything suspicious or alarming. Everything seemed perfectly normal and safe. But at some point during that afternoon, something went terribly, horribly wrong. As the afternoon slowly turned into evening and the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Elaine started watching the clock and listening for the sound of Candy's footsteps coming up the walkway to their home. She expected her daughter to arrive home at any moment, probably tired but happy after successfully selling her boxes of mints. But Candy never came through the door. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Elaine's concern began to grow with each passing moment. At around 5:30 p.m., Elaine began to feel genuinely worried. She knew it was completely unlike Candy to remain outside this late in the day. Her daughter was always obedient and responsible about following the family rules, especially the rule about being home before dark. Something felt wrong, and Elaine's motherly instincts were telling her that Candy was in trouble. As the minutes slowly dragged by, they felt like hours to the increasingly anxious mother. Elaine kept listening intently for the familiar sound of Candy's footsteps approaching the house, the sound of the front door opening, and her daughter's cheerful voice calling out, "I'm home!" But those sounds never came. The house remained eerily quiet, and Candy's absence became more and more alarming with each minute that passed. By around 6 p.m., Elaine's anxiety had reached a fever pitch, and she was absolutely certain that something had gone wrong. Her daughter should have been home at least an hour ago. Elaine couldn't wait any longer. She immediately picked up the telephone and called Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, to inform him about the situation. She explained that Candy had gone out to sell campfire mints several hours ago and had not returned home as expected. Stanley Newton immediately understood the seriousness of the situation and told Elaine he would start looking for Candy right away. Other relatives, friends, and neighbors were also quickly informed that Candy had not returned home and that people were needed to help search for her. Word spread rapidly through the tight-knit community, and people immediately dropped what they were doing to help look for the missing girl. By 6:30 p.m., a small but determined group of people had assembled and were out searching the neighborhood for Candy. They began by systematically going door to door and asking people throughout the area if they had seen the little girl that afternoon. Several people confirmed that they had indeed seen Candy earlier in the day. They remembered seeing her walking around the neighborhood, clutching the boxes of campfire mints she was selling, and smiling her friendly smile as she went from house to house. But nobody seemed to know where exactly Candy might be now. No one had seen her in the past hour or two, and no one could provide any information about where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. The searchers grew more concerned as they continued asking questions and coming up empty-handed. At some point that evening, the authorities were officially notified about the missing girl. The Spokane Police Department was contacted, and they immediately took the report seriously. Missing children cases were treated with the highest priority, and police officers and sheriff's deputies were quickly dispatched to the area to join in the search for Candy. At around 9 p.m., that same Friday night, several hours after Candy had first gone missing, a group of searchers made an important and potentially significant discovery. They came across some boxes of campfire mints lying abandoned on the ground. The boxes were found scattered across Patton Drive, not far from the Fort George Wright Bridge that crossed the Spokane River. The searchers immediately recognized these as the same type of mints that Candy had been selling. They counted the boxes carefully and discovered that there were 6 boxes lying there on the ground. This was significant because Candy had left home with 7 boxes. Where was the 7th box? And more importantly, where was Candy? The discovery of the abandoned mint boxes gave the searchers hope that they were getting closer to finding Candy, but it also raised troubling questions. Why would Candy simply drop or abandon the boxes she was supposed to be selling? Had something happened to her? Had someone taken her? The searchers didn't want to think about these dark possibilities, but they couldn't help but worry. Despite the discovery of the mint boxes and the continued efforts of dozens of searchers who combed through the neighborhood looking in every possible place they could think of, that night's search proved to be frustrating and futile. There was no sign of Candy Rogers anywhere in the area. It was as if the 9-year-old girl had simply vanished without a trace into thin air. As darkness fully fell and visibility became extremely limited, the search efforts had to be temporarily suspended for the night. Searchers reluctantly went home, planning to resume their efforts at first light the next morning. They all hoped and prayed that Candy would be found safe and sound, perhaps lost in the woods or hiding somewhere scared but unharmed. That night was an absolute nightmare for Elaine Rogers. She could hardly sleep a wink throughout the long, dark hours. She lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to quiet her mind or calm her racing heart. Many terrible thoughts raced through her mind as she wondered if her daughter was okay. The uncertainty and not knowing what had happened to her only child was absolutely unbearable and too much for any mother to endure. Elaine silently cried into her pillow throughout the night and prayed desperately to God that Candy would somehow return home safely to her. She promised herself that if Candy came back, she would never let her out of her sight again. The following morning was Saturday, March 7, 1959, and by then, the news about Candy's disappearance had spread throughout the entire city of Spokane like wildfire. The story was reported prominently in the local newspaper that very morning, complete with Candy's photograph and details about when and where she was last seen. The headline grabbed everyone's attention, and the entire community was shocked and deeply concerned about the missing little girl. By early morning, well-meaning individuals from all over Spokane and the surrounding areas began trooping out in large numbers to join in the search for Candy. Hundreds of volunteers showed up ready to help in any way they could. The response from the community was overwhelming, and demonstrated how much people cared about finding this little girl and bringing her home safely. The search effort that day was massive and highly organized. Police officers and sheriff's deputies rode on horseback as well as in vehicles to conduct the search across a wide area. They looked through dense woods and forests, searched along major roads and highways, checked ditches and ravines, and investigated any location where a small child might have gotten lost or where someone might have taken her. The United States Air Force, which had a significant presence in the Spokane area, also stepped forward to assist in the search by providing military resources. They offered the use of a Sikorsky H-19 Chickasaw helicopter and trained personnel to help search from the air. This was a significant contribution, as the helicopter could cover much more ground, much more quickly than searchers on foot could, and the aerial view might reveal clues that would be impossible to see from the ground. The helicopter was boarded by 4 trained Air Force airmen who would serve as spotters, looking out the windows and scanning the ground below for any sign of Candy. A 5th airman served as the pilot and was responsible for safely operating the aircraft. The men took off and began flying over various areas around Spokane, paying particular attention to the Spokane River and the surrounding forests where a lost child might have wandered. As the helicopter flew low over the Spokane River, carefully scanning the riverbanks and the water below for any sign of the missing girl, disaster suddenly struck without warning. The pilot was concentrating intensely on maintaining the proper altitude and speed, while his crew searched for Candy. He was flying quite low to give the spotters a better view of the ground below. But in his focus on the search mission, the pilot failed to see a high-tension electrical power line that was stretched across the area until it was too late. By the time he spotted the wire, there was no time to react or pull up to avoid it. The helicopter flew directly into the power line with tremendous force. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The helicopter was struck by the live electrical wire, causing massive damage to the aircraft systems. The pilot instantly lost control of the helicopter as critical flight systems failed. The aircraft began to spin wildly out of control, spiraling downward toward the river below. The pilot desperately tried to regain control and save his crew, but it was impossible. The helicopter was falling too fast and was too badly damaged. Within seconds, the out-of-control helicopter crashed violently into the freezing cold waters of the Spokane River with a tremendous splash. The impact was devastating. The helicopter was destroyed, and 3 of the 5 brave airmen on board were instantly killed in the horrific crash. The 3 men who tragically lost their lives that day while searching for Candy Rogers were Airman Merlin D. Ray, Sergeant William A. McDonnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fiteche. These 3 heroes gave their lives trying to help find a missing little girl they had never even met. Their sacrifice and dedication to helping others would never be forgotten by the Spokane community. The 2 surviving airmen were pulled from the wreckage in the cold water, injured but alive. They were rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment of their injuries. The community was absolutely devastated by this tragic accident that had occurred during the search efforts. Everyone who had joined in the search for Candy was deeply saddened by the loss of these 3 brave men who had given their lives trying to help. Many people broke down in tears when they heard the news of the helicopter crash and the deaths of the airmen. It was a dark moment in what was already a terrible situation. However, despite the overwhelming grief and the shocking tragedy of losing 3 lives, the tragedy did very little to discourage the volunteers and law enforcement officers from continuing to search for Candy. If anything, their determination and resolve were strengthened. They remained absolutely committed to finding the little girl, and they intensified their efforts with renewed purpose. None of them wanted the deaths of these 3 heroes to be in vain. They felt they owed it to the fallen airmen to complete the mission they had started. But despite everyone's absolute best efforts, despite the hundreds of volunteers searching tirelessly day after day, despite the police officers working around the clock following up on every possible lead, they had no luck whatsoever in locating Candy. Day after day passed with no sign of the missing girl, and the situation became more dire with each passing hour. For several agonizing days, and then weeks, it was as if Candy had simply vanished without a trace from the face of the earth. There were no more clues, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious, no evidence of what had happened to her. The mystery deepened, and people began to fear the worst. With each passing day that Candy remained missing, her mother, Elaine, began to deteriorate both physically and emotionally. She completely refused to touch any of her meals, unable to eat even a single bite of food because her stomach was tied in knots of worry and grief. She would constantly stare into space for hours at a time, her mind completely overwhelmed and unable to focus on anything except wondering where her daughter was and what might have happened to her. Not knowing the whereabouts of her only daughter, not knowing if Candy was alive or dead, suffering or safe, was slowly driving Elaine insane with grief and worry. Her entire world had collapsed the moment Candy disappeared, and nothing else mattered to her except getting her daughter back. March 22, 1959, marked exactly 16 days since Candy had first disappeared. It was a day that would bring the search to a heartbreaking and tragic conclusion that nobody wanted, but many had begun to fear was coming. That afternoon, two young airmen from the Air Force Base named Howard Lawrence and Richard Bergen were out in a wooded area about 7 miles away from Candy's home. They were hunting for woodchucks, which were small animals that were commonly hunted for sport in the area. The two men were walking through the dense forest, their rifles in hand, carefully watching for any sign of their prey. Upon getting to a small clearing in the thick forest, something unusual caught their attention. They noticed a small pair of blue suede shoes lying on the ground in the middle of the clearing. The shoes immediately stood out because they looked completely out of place in this remote wooded area, so far from any houses or roads. The two airmen stopped and examined the shoes more closely. The delicate craftsmanship of the shoes and the extremely small size clearly indicated that they belonged to a child, probably a young girl, based on the style. The men were completely baffled and confused about how these shoes had gotten there, so far away from town and civilization, in the middle of the woods, where no child should have any reason to be. After looking around the immediate area and waiting for a while to see if anyone would come out of the woods to claim the shoes, perhaps a child who had lost them while playing or hiking, they decided to pick up the shoes and bring them back to their Air Force base. Something about the discovery felt wrong and significant to them. The two men could not stop talking about the mysterious shoes they had discovered in the woods. The news of their unusual find soon spread rapidly like wildfire throughout the base. When other airmen heard about the shoes, many of them immediately thought about Candy Rogers, the little girl who had been missing for over 2 weeks and whose face had been on the front page of the newspaper and on missing person posters all over the city. The shoes were promptly handed over to the Spokane Police Department so that investigators could examine them. The police immediately contacted Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, and asked him if he would be willing to come down to the police station to look at the shoes and see if he could identify them. They had a strong suspicion that the shoes might belong to Candy, but they needed family members to confirm this before they could be certain. When Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, arrived at the police station and was shown the small blue suede shoes, his heart sank into his stomach. He examined them carefully, turning them over in his hands and looking at every detail. After a long moment, he told the police officers with a heavy heart that the shoes indeed looked very similar to ones that Candy had worn in the past. He was fairly certain they were his granddaughter's shoes, though he couldn't be 100% positive without asking Elaine to identify them. With this confirmation from Candy's grandfather, police officers made an immediate decision to focus all of their search efforts on the wooded area where the shoes had been found. If the shoes belonged to Candy, then her body might be somewhere nearby in those woods. However, since darkness was already beginning to fall, and it had grown too dark outside to conduct a proper search that night, they reluctantly agreed to wait until the following morning, when they would have full daylight to work with. They didn't want to miss any potential evidence or clues by stumbling around in the dark. The following day was Sunday, March 23, 1959. By the crack of dawn, a large team of police officers and dedicated volunteers had arrived at the clearing in the woods where the blue suede shoes had been discovered the previous day. Everyone understood the gravity and importance of this search, and they were all prepared for the possibility that they might find Candy's body rather than find her alive. The searchers immediately began systematically and carefully looking through the surrounding area, spreading out in a grid pattern to ensure that no square inch of ground was left unexamined. They looked under bushes, behind trees, in ditches, and anywhere else a small body might be hidden or might have come to rest. Initially, despite their best efforts and thoroughness, the searchers found nothing of significance. After some time had passed with no discoveries, one of the police officers was searching through a particularly dense part of the forest when he suddenly came across something that looked strange and out of place. There was a small mound on the forest floor that appeared to be deliberately made up of brush, branches, and pine needles that had been carefully piled together. The pile looked artificial rather than natural, as if someone had intentionally created it to hide something underneath. The officer found this mound very strange and suspicious. His instincts told him something was wrong. He decided he needed to take a much closer look to see what, if anything, might be hidden underneath the pile. He approached carefully and slowly. To his absolute horror, it did not take him long to see a small human knee sticking out from under the pile of debris. His heart began racing as the terrible reality of what he was looking at sank in. He had found a body, and it appeared to be the body of a child. The officer carefully and gently began brushing away the leaves, pine needles, and branches that had been deliberately placed over the body to conceal it from view. As more and more of the body was revealed, the officer could see clearly that it was the decomposing body of a young girl. The body had been lying in the woods for over 2 weeks, exposed to the elements and wildlife, and decomposition had begun. Based on the size of the body, the clothing, and the general description, the officer instantly recognized her as Candy Rogers, the little girl they had been desperately searching for. He had found her, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The nightmare scenario that everyone had feared had come true. The officer noticed several deeply disturbing things about the condition of Candy's body and the way it had been positioned. The clothes she was wearing were torn in several places, showing signs of a struggle or violent assault. When the officer looked down at her feet, he noticed with growing horror that they were bound together. A torn strip of cloth, apparently torn from her own clothing, had been used to tie her ankles together so she couldn't run away or escape. Even more disturbing, there was another strip of clothing wrapped tightly around her small neck. The implications of this were immediately clear to the experienced police officer. Candy had been strangled to death. The officer quickly alerted all the other searchers in the area, and within minutes, everyone had gathered around the tragic discovery. The body was carefully and respectfully removed from the area and transported to the medical examiner's office for an official autopsy that would determine the exact cause of death and document any evidence that might help identify the killer. Candy's relatives, including her devastated mother Elaine and her grandfather Stanley Newton, were immediately contacted and informed about the terrible discovery. The police had to tell them that Candy had been found, but that she was dead, and that the circumstances surrounding her death suggested she had been murdered. Upon hearing the devastating news that her precious daughter was dead, that her baby girl had been killed and would never be coming home again, Elaine completely lost consciousness. The shock and grief were simply too much for her body and mind to handle. She fainted and collapsed on the floor, and emergency medical personnel had to be called to provide treatment. She was placed under heavy sedation by doctors to help her cope with the overwhelming trauma and to prevent her from completely breaking down mentally. More than 1,000 searchers who had volunteered their time, resources, and energy over the past 16 days to look for Candy were absolutely shocked and devastated by the news that she had been found murdered. Many of them had held out hope that she might still be found alive, perhaps lost in the woods or being held somewhere, but ultimately okay. The confirmation that she was dead and had been murdered in such a brutal way hit the entire community like a punch to the gut. There was a general feeling of dread, anger, and fear that hung heavy in the air throughout Spokane. From that moment forward, many people in the community began to seriously fear for their own safety as well as the safety of their children. If something this horrible could happen to a sweet, innocent little girl like Candy Rogers in broad daylight in their own neighborhood, then it could happen to anyone. Parents became much more protective of their children, and the sense of innocence and safety that had characterized Spokane in the 1950s was shattered forever. The autopsy that was conducted on Candy's body by the medical examiner revealed horrific details about what had been done to her in her final moments of life. The examination confirmed what investigators had already suspected based on the condition of the body and the cloth around her neck. Candy had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The autopsy showed that strips of her own clothing had been torn off and used first to restrain her, tying her up so she couldn't escape or fight back effectively, and then to strangle her until she stopped breathing and died. The brutality and violence of the crime were shocking, and it was clear that Candy had suffered terribly before her death. Detectives from the Spokane Police Department immediately launched a full-scale homicide investigation to find out who the culprit was and bring them to justice. This was now officially a murder case, and every available resource would be devoted to solving it. "We'll put every available man on the case and keep them there till the thing is solved," Police Chief Clifford Payne told the media at the time during a press conference. His voice was filled with determination and anger at what had been done to an innocent child in his city. A massive number of individuals were questioned by detectives in the days and weeks following the discovery of Candy's body. The police interviewed everyone who lived in the neighborhood, everyone who had seen Candy on the day she disappeared, all known sex offenders in the area, and anyone else who might have information about the case. But despite all these interviews and all the leads they followed, detectives were frustratingly unable to get any helpful information that would point them toward a specific suspect. The very first person that the authorities strongly suspected of committing the crime was an imprisoned serial killer by the name of Hugh Beyond Morse, and investigators had very good reasons for believing that he might have been involved in Candy's murder. Hugh Beyond Morse was a violent criminal who was already in prison serving a life sentence for committing 2 other brutal murders in the Spokane area. He had killed women in 1959 and 1960, and his method of operation and the violence he used were similar to what had been done to Candy. But there was one specific piece of evidence that made investigators particularly suspicious of Morse. When the medical examiner conducted the autopsy on Candy's body, they noticed a strange purple smear on her clothes. When they examined and tested this substance, they discovered it was grape-flavored chewing gum. This seemed like an odd and specific detail, but it became much more significant when investigators learned that Hugh Beyond Morse was known for having a special liking for grape-flavored gum. He chewed it constantly and always had it with him. Finding grape gum residue on Candy's clothing seemed like too much of a coincidence to ignore. Based on this circumstantial evidence, investigators brought Morse in for questioning about Candy's murder. They confronted him with the evidence and asked him directly if he had killed Candy Rogers. However, Morse firmly denied any involvement in her death. He insisted he had nothing to do with it and refused to confess to the crime. Since there was no concrete physical evidence to definitively prove that Morse was the killer they were looking for, and since he maintained his innocence and they couldn't place him at the scene of the crime, or prove he had ever met Candy, criminal charges could not be brought against him at that time. Under the American legal system, prosecutors need solid evidence to charge someone with a crime, and while the grape gum was suspicious, it wasn't enough on its own to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Morse had killed Candy. However, despite the lack of sufficient evidence to charge him, Hugh Beyond Morse remained a prime suspect in the case for many, many years afterward. Detectives kept his name at the top of their list of potential suspects, and every time new evidence came to light or new investigative techniques became available, they would revisit Morse as a possible perpetrator. Apart from Morse, detectives also carefully investigated several other tips and leads that poured in from the public after Candy's death. Hundreds of people called the police department with information they thought might be relevant or helpful. Some people reported seeing suspicious individuals in the area on the day Candy disappeared. Others claimed to know someone whose behavior had changed after Candy's murder, or who had made suspicious comments about the case. Every single tip, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was carefully documented and investigated by detectives who were desperate for any clue that might lead them to the killer. But tragically, none of these tips proved to be of any real use in solving the case. Every lead turned out to be a dead end. Witnesses couldn't provide enough specific details to identify a suspect. People who seemed suspicious initially turned out to have solid alibis for where they were when Candy was killed. The investigation was going nowhere, and the killer remained at large. Candy Rogers was eventually laid to rest in a funeral ceremony that was attended by hundreds of grieving community members. Her devastated family members, especially her mother, Elaine, hoped and prayed desperately that Candy's killer would be identified and brought to justice sooner rather than later. They wanted to see the person who had done this terrible thing punished for their crime. They wanted justice for Candy. They needed to know who had taken their precious girl away from them and why. But several months went by after Candy's funeral, and the case remained a frustratingly tough one for detectives to crack. Despite working tirelessly and following every possible lead, they simply couldn't identify the killer. The case began to grow cold as months turned into years with no breakthrough. The tragedy of Candy's death had devastating long-term effects on her family that extended far beyond the initial grief. In June 1963, 4 long and painful years after Candy's death, her father, Carl Rogers, who had been divorced from Elaine for years, sadly and tragically took his own life. He committed suicide because he was unable to cope with the overwhelming grief and guilt of losing his only daughter in such a horrible way. At the time of his death, Carl had been living alone in a hotel room in Walla Walla, Washington, far from Spokane and far from the life he had once known. The pain of losing Candy, combined with whatever other struggles and demons he was facing, became too much for him to bear. He apparently felt that life without his daughter wasn't worth living and that the pain would never end. So he made the terrible decision to end his own life, leaving behind more grief and trauma for the family that was still reeling from Candy's murder. Carl Rogers died, never knowing who had killed his little girl. He died without ever seeing justice served for Candy. Years went by slowly, and as they did, Candy Rogers began to fade from the memories of many people in the community. New generations of residents moved to Spokane who had never heard of Candy Rogers or the unsolved murder that had haunted the city in 1959. Life moved on, as it inevitably does, and newer crimes and concerns took the attention of both the public and law enforcement. But Candy's family never forgot her, and remarkably, the detectives of the Spokane Police Department never forgot her either. Even as the case grew colder and colder with each passing year, even as officers who had worked on the original investigation retired or passed away, the case file was passed down from one generation of detectives to the next, with each new detective making a commitment to solve it if they possibly could. This is the kind of case that's been the giant logjam for cold cases here in Spokane. I keep saying it's the Mount Everest of our cold cases, the one that we could never seem to overcome. But at the same time, nobody ever forgot, said Detective Zach, storeman of the Spokane Police Department Major Crimes Unit, many years later when reflecting on the decades-long investigation. The case remained active in the sense that any new tips or information that came in were still investigated, and detectives periodically reviewed the case file, hoping to spot something that previous investigators might have missed. But without any new evidence or leads, there was simply nowhere for the investigation to go. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Everything changed in the early 2000s when there had been a significant advancement in DNA technology compared to what had been available in the 1950s when Candy was killed. In 1959, DNA testing and analysis didn't exist at all. Forensic science was much more primitive, and investigators relied primarily on witness testimony, fingerprints, and physical evidence that could be seen with the naked eye. The very concept of DNA and genetic testing was still decades away from becoming a reality. But by 2001, DNA testing had become a powerful and revolutionary tool in criminal investigations. Scientists could now extract DNA from tiny samples of biological material, blood, saliva, semen, skin cells, hair, and create a genetic profile that was unique to each individual person. This DNA profile could then be compared to DNA from suspects to determine with extremely high certainty whether they were the source of the biological material found at a crime scene. Detectives working on Candy's case realized that this new technology might finally provide the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Candy's clothes from when her body was found back in 1959 had been carefully stored by the authorities as evidence all these years. The clothes had been kept in proper conditions to preserve any biological evidence they might contain. These clothes were now submitted to a forensic laboratory, with the fervent hope that the killer's DNA could be identified from them after all these decades. Forensic investigators at the crime lab quickly got to work examining Candy's clothing with sophisticated equipment and techniques that would have seemed like science fiction in 1959. They focused particularly on Candy's underwear, knowing that sexual assault had occurred and that the perpetrator might have left biological evidence behind. After careful analysis, the forensic scientists made an exciting discovery. They were able to determine that there was semen on Candy's underwear from her attacker. Even after more than 40 years, enough biological material remained that they could work with it. The scientists were able to successfully isolate DNA from this semen sample and use it to create a complete DNA profile of Candy's killer. It was an incredibly exciting and emotional moment for the detectives who had worked on the case for so long. For the first time in over 4 decades, they felt like they were genuinely close to solving the case and identifying who had killed Candy. The DNA profile was like a genetic fingerprint of the killer, and now all they had to do was find a match. The newly developed DNA profile was uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System. Combined DNA Index System is a national database maintained by the FBI that contains DNA profiles from convicted criminals, unsolved crime scenes, and missing persons. When a new DNA profile is uploaded, the computer system automatically searches through millions of other profiles looking for a match. But unfortunately, when the search was completed, no match was found in the database. This was deeply disappointing news for investigators. It meant that whoever had killed Candy had either never been arrested and convicted of another crime that would have required their DNA to be collected, or the crime had occurred before DNA collection became standard practice for criminals. In 2002, detectives decided it was finally time to conclusively determine whether Hugh Bion Morse, who had been their prime suspect for over 40 years, was actually the man who had killed Candy Rogers. Now that they had a DNA profile from the killer, they could compare it directly to Morse's DNA and know for certain whether he was guilty or innocent. Morse was still alive at this time, still serving his life sentence in prison for the other murders he had committed. DNA samples were collected from him and sent to the lab for comparison with the DNA profile from Candy's clothing. However, when the results came back from the laboratory, they brought disappointing news that forced investigators to completely rethink their theories about the case. The DNA comparison showed definitively that Hugh Byron Morse was not a match to the DNA profile from the crime scene. The man who had been the prime suspect in Candy's murder for more than 4 decades was completely innocent of this particular crime. He had not killed Candy Rogers. This was a significant setback for the investigation. Detectives had been so convinced for so many years that Morse was their killer, and now they had to accept that they had been wrong all along. They were essentially back to square one, with no suspects and no clear direction for the investigation to go. After ruling out Hugh Byron Morse, nothing of significant interest would surface in the case for a long time. The investigation languished once again, with the DNA profile sitting in the database but no matches being found. Years continued to pass, and it seemed like the case might never be solved despite the DNA evidence. In September 2006, Candy's heartbroken mother, Elaine, quietly passed away in her home at the age of 82. She had lived for 47 years after her daughter's murder. 47 years of wondering who had killed Candy and why. 47 years of hoping that someday, before she died, she would finally get answers and see justice served for her precious little girl. But Elaine Rogers died not knowing who had killed her daughter. She died without ever getting the closure and justice she so desperately needed and deserved. By this point, both of Candy's parents had died without ever learning the truth about what happened to their daughter. Candy's grandparents had also passed away years earlier. The people who had loved Candy most in the world, who had suffered the most from her loss, would never know the identity of her killer. Around 2017, a revolutionary new investigative technique called forensic genetic genealogy came into the spotlight and began gaining popularity as a powerful method for solving cold cases that had seemed impossible to crack using traditional investigation methods. Forensic genetic genealogy is a fascinating scientific method that uses DNA analysis combined with traditional genealogical research methods to solve crimes and identify missing persons. In other words, it combines cutting-edge genetic science with old-fashioned family history research to piece together clues and bring justice to victims and their loved ones. The technique works by taking DNA from a crime scene and uploading it to public genealogy databases, where millions of people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. The system then searches for people in the database who share portions of DNA with the unknown person, indicating they are related somehow, perhaps cousins, or second cousins, or more distant relatives. Genealogists then build out family trees for these DNA matches, going back through generations to find common ancestors. By carefully analyzing the family trees and the pattern of shared DNA, experts can work forward through the generations to identify which specific person is likely to be the source of the crime scene DNA. This technique had gained national attention when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had terrorized California for decades and had never been caught. That high-profile case proved that forensic genetic genealogy could solve even the oldest and coldest of cases. When detectives in Spokane learned about this new technique and saw the success it was having in solving other cold cases around the country, they decided they had to give it a try with Candy's case. They were willing to try anything that might finally give them the breakthrough they needed. In February 2021, more than 62 years after Candy's murder, the Spokane Police Department reached out to a company called Othram to inquire about whether Othram's specialized technology and methods could help with the case. Othram is a private forensic laboratory located in Texas that specializes in using advanced DNA sequencing techniques to develop DNA profiles from extremely old, degraded, or contaminated biological samples that other labs cannot work with. The DNA sample that had been extracted from Candy's clothing back in 2001 was degraded, meaning that over the decades the DNA molecules had broken down and deteriorated. This made it much more difficult to work with than fresh DNA samples. Additionally, the sample was contaminated with non-human DNA from bacteria, fungi, and other environmental sources that had been on the clothing during the 40 years it was stored. Many forensic laboratories would have said that this sample was too degraded and too contaminated to be useful for genealogy purposes. But Othram had developed proprietary techniques and technology specifically designed to work with challenging samples like this one. After evaluating the case details and the condition of the DNA sample, Othram responded positively. They believed they could work with Candy's case and potentially develop a usable genealogical profile from the degraded DNA. This was incredibly exciting news for the Spokane detectives. The remaining DNA extract was shipped to Othrum's laboratory in Texas in March 2021. The scientists at Othram then used a cutting-edge technique called forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive genealogical profile from the DNA evidence. This process involved using extremely sensitive equipment to read and sequence every piece of DNA they could extract from the sample, then using sophisticated computer algorithms to reconstruct a complete genetic profile that could be used for genealogical research. The process was time-consuming and highly technical, requiring months of painstaking laboratory work. But finally, the Othram scientists successfully constructed a complete DNA profile that was suitable for genetic genealogy research. Once the DNA profile was complete, the Othram genealogy team began the detective work of using that DNA profile to search for distant genetic relatives who might help reveal the identity of the man who had left his DNA at the crime scene 62 years earlier. The genealogists uploaded the profile to various public genealogy databases and began searching for matches. They found several people who shared small amounts of DNA with the unknown perpetrator, indicating they were related to him in some way, probably as distant cousins. The genealogists then painstakingly built out detailed family trees for each of these DNA matches, going back multiple generations to identify common ancestors. By carefully analyzing these family trees and the patterns of shared DNA, the genealogy experts could work forward through time to identify which branches of the family tree might contain the person they were looking for. By Labor Day weekend in September 2021, after months of intensive genealogical research, the Othram team had a major breakthrough. They had successfully narrowed the search down to 3 specific brothers who were all potential matches for being the source of the DNA from Candy's clothing. Their names were John Ray Hoff, Andrew Hoff, and Terry Hoff. The genealogists returned these investigative leads to Detective Zach Stormont from the Spokane Police Department Major Crimes Unit. After more than 6 decades of investigation, the detectives finally had specific names of suspects to investigate. It was an incredibly exciting and emotional moment for everyone involved in the case. Empowered by these new leads from Othram, Detective Zach Stormont and his investigative team immediately began conducting thorough background checks on all 3 of the Hoff brothers to learn everything they could about them. The first thing they discovered was sobering. All 3 of the brothers were long dead. They had died years or even decades earlier. John had died in 1970, and Andrew and Terry had also passed away, though the exact years weren't publicly specified. This meant that none of them could be arrested, prosecuted, or brought to justice in a courtroom. They would never face a judge or jury for what they had done. However, even though the suspects were dead, it was still critically important to definitively identify which one of the 3 brothers had killed Candy. Her surviving family members deserved to know the truth, and the historical record needed to be accurate. As detectives continued their investigation and dug deeper into the backgrounds of the 3 brothers, they made an important discovery. They found that one of the brothers, John Ray Hoff, had died in 1970 at the young age of just 30 years old. Importantly, he had been survived by a wife and a daughter. Detectives decided to reach out to John Hoff's daughter, a woman named Kathy, to see if she would be willing to help them confirm whether her father or perhaps one of his brothers might be responsible for a decades-old crime. This was undoubtedly a difficult and sensitive conversation to have with someone, telling them that their deceased father might have been a murderer. When Kathy was initially contacted by detectives and told that they were investigating her father, she said that she immediately went online and searched for little girl murdered in 1959. That search led her to information about Candy Rogers' case. Despite the shocking and disturbing nature of what she was being told, Kathy agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. She voluntarily provided detectives with a DNA sample from herself, understanding that this would help them determine whether her father was involved in Candy's murder. The DNA sample that Kathy provided was sent to the forensic laboratory for analysis. The lab compared Kathy's DNA to the DNA profile from the crime scene to see if there was a familial relationship. When the results came back from the laboratory, they were absolutely astonishing and provided the evidence that detectives needed. The analysis revealed that it was 2.9 million times more likely that Kathy's DNA was related to the suspect DNA profile from the crime scene than to the general population. In statistical terms, this was an extraordinarily strong match that provided overwhelming evidence of a biological relationship. This result meant that there was virtually no doubt that Kathy was the biological daughter of the man who had killed Candy Rogers. The odds of this relationship occurring by random chance were essentially 0. Her father was the killer. With this information, detectives became increasingly certain that John Ray Hoff was the killer they had spent more than 6 decades searching for. But they weren't done investigating yet. They wanted to learn everything they could about John Hoff: who he was, where he lived, what kind of person he was, and whether there was any connection between him and Candy. Detectives conducted an extensive background check on John Ray Hoff, pulling up every record they could find about his life. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of a troubled and violent man. The background investigation revealed that John Hoff had grown up in Spokane, Washington, the same city where Candy lived. Even more significantly, at the time of Candy's murder in March 1959, John Hoff lived approximately 1 mile away from Candy's home. He would have been very familiar with her neighborhood and could have easily walked or driven there in just a few minutes. Detectives also uncovered details about John Hoff's troubled past and his history of violence, particularly violence directed at women. In 1956, when he was just 17 years old, John enlisted in the United States Army. However, his military service would be short-lived and would end in disgrace. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's death, John Hoff was arrested for a violent assault on a woman. According to police reports and court documents from the time, Hoff had approached an unknown woman and used physical force to violently remove her clothes while she struggled desperately against him and screamed for help. After forcibly stripping the woman, Hoff then used her own clothes as restraints to tie her up so she couldn't escape or fight back. He then attempted to strangle her, wrapping his hands or the clothing around her neck and squeezing. The parallels to what had been done to Candy Rogers were absolutely chilling and impossible to ignore. The modus operandi, the method of committing the crime, was virtually identical. Hoff had used the victim's own clothing to restrain her and then to strangle her, exactly as had been done to Candy. Luckily, the woman in the 1961 attack survived the horrific ordeal. She managed to escape, or someone intervened before Hoff succeeded in killing her. She lived to testify against him and see him prosecuted for the attack. For this violent crime, John Hoff was convicted and spent 6 months in prison. However, 6 months was an incredibly lenient sentence for such a brutal attack, and it reflected attitudes toward violence against women that were unfortunately common in that era. When Hoff was released from prison after serving his short sentence, the Army labeled him as a deserter because he had failed to return to his military duties, and they discharged him from service with a dishonorable or less than honorable discharge. His military career was over in disgrace. After his release from prison and discharge from the Army, John Hoff appears to have led a relatively normal life on the surface. He worked in various blue-collar jobs to make ends meet, including working as a door-to-door salesman going from house to house selling products, and also working in a lumber yard doing manual labor. To people who knew him casually, he probably seemed like an ordinary working-class man trying to support himself and his family. He got married and had a daughter, Kathy. Outwardly, he appeared to be living a normal, law-abiding life. But whatever demons haunted John Hoff, whatever darkness lived inside him, apparently never left him. At the young age of just 31 years old, John Ray Hoff ended up taking his own life. He committed suicide, leaving behind his wife and young daughter. The exact circumstances of his death and what motivated him to end his life were never publicly disclosed, but one can speculate that guilt, mental illness, or other personal troubles played a role. Apart from the DNA evidence and John Hoff's history of violence against women, detectives also uncovered a possible direct connection between John Hoff and Candy Rogers that explained how he might have known about her or encountered her before the murder. The investigation revealed that John Hoff's stepsister was a 10-year-old girl who was a member of the Campfire Girls organization at the time of Candy's murder in 1959. More specifically, she had taken on the role of being Candy's big sister in the Campfire program. The Campfire Girls program had a mentorship system where older girls would be paired with younger girls to help guide them, teach them skills, and provide friendship and support. John Hoff's stepsister had been assigned to be Candy's big sister in this program, which meant the two girls would have spent time together regularly at campfire meetings and activities. Detectives believed that this was very likely how John Hoff might have first seen or learned about Candy Rogers. If his stepsister was involved in Campfire Girls and mentoring Candy, John might have picked up his stepsister from meetings, attended campfire events with his family, or heard his stepsister talk about Candy at home. This gave John Hoff both knowledge of Candy's existence and possibly information about her routines, her neighborhood, and her participation in campfire activities like selling mints door to door. It's possible that John Hoff saw Candy at some point and became fixated on her, or that he knew she would be out selling campfire mints that day and deliberately went to her neighborhood looking for her. Whether the murder was premeditated or opportunistic remains unknown, but the connection through the campfire girls provided a plausible explanation for how a 20-year-old man would have encountered a 9-year-old girl. Even though detectives now had extremely strong evidence pointing to John Ray Hoff as Candy's killer, they decided to take one final step to absolutely confirm his identity beyond any possible doubt. They wanted to obtain John Hoff's DNA directly from his body and compare it to the DNA from the crime scene to create a perfect, direct match. With Kathy's permission and cooperation, as well as a search warrant approved by a judge, detectives and forensic team members traveled to the cemetery where John Ray Hoff was buried. More than 50 years after his death, his grave was opened and his corpse was exhumed. Forensic scientists carefully collected DNA samples from John Hoff's remains. Even after decades of being buried, enough DNA remained in his bones and teeth to create a profile. These DNA samples were sent to the forensic laboratory for testing in comparison with the DNA profile from Candy's clothing. When the final results came back from the laboratory, they provided exactly the confirmation that everyone expected. The DNA from John Ray Hoff's exhumed body was a perfect match to the DNA profile from the crime scene. There was absolutely no doubt whatsoever. John Ray Hoff had killed Candy Rogers. The case that had haunted Spokane for over 62 years, that had consumed the careers of multiple generations of detectives, that had remained unsolved despite thousands of hours of investigation, was finally solved. They knew who killed Candy Rogers. Some of Candy's surviving relatives, including cousins and other extended family members who still lived in the Spokane area, were contacted by detectives and informed about the major breakthrough in the case. The news that, after all these decades, the killer had finally been identified brought mixed emotions. It's not closure, but at least there's some form of satisfaction knowing that the person who did it is at least named. He may be in a grave, but he's named, said 7-year-old Joanne Poss, a cousin of Candy's, when interviewed by the media after the announcement. Joanne and other family members expressed gratitude that the truth had finally been uncovered, even though it came so many years too late for the people who needed it most. The family remained deeply saddened by the fact that Candy's grandparents and parents never got to know who had killed their beloved little girl. The injustice of that Candy's mother, Elaine, had lived 47 years without answers, that her father Carl had taken his own life, still not knowing who was responsible, weighed heavily on the surviving family members. But at least now, finally, they knew the truth. Candy's name could rest alongside the name of her killer in the historical record. Future generations would know what happened to her and who was responsible. Rest in peace, Candy Rogers. Your story has finally been told, and the truth has finally been revealed.